Today we're going to talk about sponge float plastering. I'm going to discuss whether it's as bad as all the plasterers make out. I'm going to talk about the process, I'm going to talk about the results, how it looks after, how it compares to traditional plastering, but more importantly, we're going to discuss the real problem that involves sponge float plastering that could totally ruin your results in the future. Right then, today we're going to be looking at some sponging. Now the reason I'm doing this is my mate uploaded a video and he got loads of abuse for it. So I just want to see, is it as bad as everyone makes out? Now, we're working on these slope ceilings, or as I call them, skeelings, and I'm just going to give it a test run. So we're working on bonding here, so obviously we've got a bit of a higher suction rate. So it's probably the ideal time to start looking at something to kill the suction a little bit, but also give us a flatter result in the end. So today, I'm going to be sponging, and I'm going to tackle everyone's hate towards it and see if it's as bad as everyone makes out. Dear James, it's called Plastering Takeover. It's basically where chippies learn to plaster. Yeah, right. James is a chippy, but he's been put onto the trowel. Now, show us exactly what it's like to flatten with a speed skim. Is it good? Look, he's dipping underneath it. Come on, that's it. And then keep your blade close to the wall. You don't want it too open like that. So tilt it inwards. That's it. And there we go. And then put a lot of pressure on it. Don't be scared of that. You want to pull the ripples out. That's it. Okay. So I suppose the question is, why would you sponge float? So it's a great way of getting your walls flat. And say if the plaster is pulling in a bit faster, so we're saying an area like bonding, like we said, low suction, and you're losing it, sponge floating is a great way to get it back under control. So another thing, a lot of plasterers now are using it just to get an overall good finish. So as soon as you've got the first flatten, which I'm up to now, I've applied 2 coats, I'm just giving it a flatten. Roughly after this point, you'd apply a sponge float, you get rid of any high spots, flatten it, and then that's all of it pretty much done. Now that's what we're going to do in a minute. I'm going to finish flattening this, then we're going to get a sponge float. I'm going to show you exactly how it works, the results you get. We're going to discuss, is it worth even criticising or is it decent? Now another thing it's good for, sometimes on bonding you can get these bubbles. This happens a lot, and it's basically where you get air trapped between the 2 coats. Now sponge floating is great for removing these imperfections. Now we're going to be looking to sponge float it. So we've applied 2 coats, give it a flatten, and now we're going to float it up. So let's show you exactly what it involves. This is a sponge float. As you can see, it's just a sponge. It's got a handle and it collects a lot of water. And the idea is you just trowel it across the wall, create a texture, and then you flatten it. Okay, so we've got the sponge float. Now the idea is we've got water on it. We literally just figure of 8 motions. Want to trowel it on, or not trowel it, we're floating it up. And what we're doing is getting rid of any high spots. It's actually a bit dry, this one, but what we're doing is creating a texture. Now this flattens any imperfections. Now a lot of people use sprayers before. I've just wetted up the sponge float as I've gone. And that's that. Oh, and is that why, did you ask that question?
No, it wasn't me, it's someone else that you answered.
So, we've got a texture and you literally just trial it out. Now, what you're left with is a really smooth section of wall, and it does remove any imperfections, and it really does do the job. I must admit, when you flattened it, it does look lovely. Now, the wetter the sponge float, the more of a texture you're going to get. At the moment, I'm just using a light mist, and to be fair, the SBR, the bonding, it's pulled in quite fast, so if this was a plasterboard wall, you get much more of a texture, but to be honest, I don't mind this amount. This is good for me. I don't want to totally bring the plaster to mush. With a nice damp sponge float without spraying the wall, you get enough texture to flatten the plaster, but you're not going to completely bring it back to nothing. So to me, this is a decent amount. You don't want to trowel it straight away because you'll end up just pulling up all the wet plaster. You'll end up with a bit of a mush. So you need that to take up a little bit. You can still write your name in, but basically you don't want to leave it too long when it's this consistency.
A few moments later.
So then we're getting rid of the texture. I don't know if you can see on the camera, but you're left with this really smooth matte looking consistency. And it is actually very flat when you use the sponge float because it does take away any high spots and it leaves you with a lovely flat wall. Now another thing, a lot of plasterers say it leaves your walls wavy. Now I'm using a solid carbon steel trowel here. Nothing flexible about this trowel. It's rigid, probably more rigid than your Marshalltown Perma shape. So one of the big debates that leaves your wall wavy, I don't think it's possible if I'm using a stiff trowel like this because it's getting it back to the flat nature that you want. So in terms of that, we can disregard that argument, but there is one big argument we need to mention. So the big problem is British Gypsum won't give you a warranty if you do sponge floating. Now the idea is, and I don't know who came up with this, I don't know if it's British Gypsum themselves or another plasterer, but basically they say if you do sponge float plastering, it affects the strength of the plaster and it basically essentially degrades it. So I think because you're sponging it back up once it's set, it compromises the strength and the actual effectiveness of the plaster. So British Gypsum won't even warrant the plaster if it's done that way. So that's probably the biggest problem with sponge floating. Now in my opinion, I've rung British Gypsum when I've had problems before, they totally ignored me and nothing happened anyways. So if that's the only reason, I'll be honest, I used to sponge float full time. I had no problems. I just got bored of the process and the faff. But let's carry on with the process, see the end results, and let's see if it is as bad as people make out. But that is a real problem we should consider as plasterers. It's very easy to flatten because all the hard work's been done. What you're left with is a smooth, flat canvas to start smoothing off. So you don't really need a lot of water either. We're not saturating. I'm just cleaning the edges. Because we've used the sponge float there, now I'm just kind of cleaning up the edges. Usually we'd do the ceilings first, but somehow the walls have been done. I'm just chipping in for a job to give a helping hand. So usually it'd be the other way around. But anyway, so now we're left with a nice clean base to work from, and actually the sponge float takes a lot of the hard work out of plastering, which makes it an ideal gateway for beginners and for anyone who has struggled with joint issues before. Sponge floating is brilliant because it does take a lot of pressure out of the game. So you can see the appeal to sponge floating. So with the light in the position it's on, you can see, even though we're only pretty much on the second flatten, how flat and how smooth the plaster is after the process. So despite it being frowned upon, you do get very good results quite easily. So, you know, other than the obvious, is it as bad as people make out? So again, the biggest argument being wavy walls. I mean, if done correctly, there's no reason it should be wavy. Just because you use a sponge float don't mean you suddenly put a massive bump in the middle of your wall. If anything, you float render to get the high spots out. So in theory, with the float, we are almost floating off any high spots as if you're doing line rendering, which is what they do with a finish coat. They use a sponge float to get off any high spots and discrepancies. So you're doing the exact same thing here. Now we're pretty much up to the last trowel. This is just a Plazy. I like to finish with a Plazy to leave a nice matte finish. And what we're left with is something that is flat, matte, and perfect for the painters. The other complaint on this video is the fact the walls are quite shiny, but I actually think you leave a generally matte finish in a plastered wall. Now here's my biggest qualms with them. Sponge floats are rubbish. These come away, they last about a week.
Look, floaty, floaty.
2, it's generally hard work. I find it's aggro, to be honest. It's painful at times. And 3, if it is true where they say it compromises the plaster and it compromises the strength, and is that something you want to risk? That is, I suppose, up to your discretion. But I don't think it should get as much grief as what it does get. The only reason I stopped is because my sponge floats kept breaking, but that was it really. The finish is good, the walls are flat, and generally you get a nice matte consistency. So I don't actually believe it should get as much hate as it does. If it works and if it does the job, then I think plasterers should let it be. I think the big problem is plasterers just don't like changing, and I think that's what it all comes down to. Change, plasterers like the traditional way, one trowel, that's it. But what do you think? Leave it below. Do you sponge float? Do you do it? Do you get good results? Let us know. Cheers.